Thanks, Chris. I hate to interrupt the flow, but I'm sure a lot of you have questions for Cameron and Chris. Yes.
Rosanna, come up as well.
As well as to Rosanna, Chris and Cameron. I know in my own policing experience as well as my training that the risk factors for homelessness are pretty much the same as the risk factors for being involved in the criminal justice. And from hearing Chris, I can see that the youth are a big part of getting into that frame of being long-term chronic homeless. So I'm curious as to whether or not there's been any research in any of the studies into the effect or risk or increased risk of a young person being involved in the criminal justice at an early age to then becoming a long-term chronic homeless person.
I don't have quantifiable risks, but when in both this research and also other research I did, ethnographic research with people living on the streets, when I interviewed people who were in their 40s and 50s, they didn't speak about falling into homelessness. And these are people who'd been on the streets for years and years and years. They didn't speak about falling into homelessness, and nor did they identify with homelessness, but rather they spoke about a long life trajectory where out-of-home care, juvenile justice, incarceration, homelessness characterise their lives. And rather than, and this is a very, very, very small section of the homeless population. I deliberately chose them on the basis of being there for years, but they didn't speak about re-engaging with mainstream society, but they spoke about engaging with it for the first time because they saw themselves as deeply excluded as long as they could remember. And homelessness was just a continuation of other forms of exclusion that they experienced, for many of them, since they were children. So for that small section of the population, engagement in the juvenile justice system, crime, and then the adult being incarcerated as an adult was all a part of a broader life biography.
So in Journeys Home, we have a number of people that have been in detention through juvenile justice or in adult detention. And you're testing my memory here. In our Wave 1 research report, I think from memory, we looked at the relationship, whether there was any correlation between people who'd been in the juvenile justice system and their lifetime experiences of homelessness. And we did find a very clear relationship from memory. Hopefully I'm not wrong there, but that kind of would make sense. We also, in the study, we follow people as they move in and out of detention. But we haven't really looked at the relationship between that and homelessness to look at whether it looks like one's causing the other or vice versa. But we fully intend to in the future. And Journeys Home is a kind of study where you can look at that relationship and what comes first kind of thing. So, yeah.
Other questions?
Hero Weston again. I have a question to both Chris and Cameron. Both of you have used the term assertive as part of outreach, that is assertive outreach in your communications. Yet a recent publication by Mackenzie, Churchill and is it Coleman, just a recently released publication, Role of Outreach, says that this descriptor assertive is at best redundant, but at worst misleading. And I just wonder whether one or other of you, or both of you, would like to comment on the use of the term assertive outreach, and what do you think we should be using in the future?
We adopted the term on the basis that that was what the program described they were using and the policy was funded to use, so it certainly wasn't a term that we developed. I actually, based on observations of the delivery of assertive outreach across 3 capital cities, based on interviews with service providers doing assertive outreach and people who are on the streets receiving it and people who are in housing who had received it. I think there are lots of dimensions to the outreach that are assertive, and I think in many respects, in addition to the fundamental linking of the housing to the outreach, which really was the key criteria, but I think there were several key dimensions in the assertiveness of the approach that contributed to effectiveness. I think Anne Coleman and others' critique is much more based on the notion of the term assertiveness rather than actual empirical evidence with people on the ground doing and receiving it and engaged in it.
I think assertive outreach means you go back many times. Because if you're trying to engage people who are long-term homeless and are living right on the margins and maybe have few contacts with services, you can't force them to come in and you can't force them to accept services. They've got to be willing to do that or prepared to do that. That's the only way you can deliver services. But you can go back to see them more than once. You can go back to see how they're going. Would they like to come, back to your service and maybe get a coffee this morning? Or would they like to have a chat? So I think assertive outreach means you don't give up. You don't say, oh, well, he didn't want to do it, or she didn't want to do it. Well, therefore, they said no, so, right, well, that's another one done. You actually say, someone living in that situation where they are acutely at risk, where they have serious health issues, where they look as though they're obviously in bad shape, you don't just give up. You actually go back and you see if you can engage them. You don't force them, but you do go back and you do talk to them and you do try to build relationships. And as I'm sure lots of you know, people on the front line often say, it takes a while to engage with some people, but that's the way it is, and that's what you do. So I'm not ashamed of the word assertive outreach. I think it actually means we care.
Got time for one or two more questions? Yes, Shelley.
Just thank you to everyone for the presentations. They were fascinating and I guess especially the street to home ones because they were so heartening. But I was kind of reflecting on, I've got a kind of comment and a question. Clearly for people to have been in that situation in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and for such lengthy periods, they're also incredibly resourceful. They've actually survived it, and they've used certain skills and capabilities. I'm interested that we don't ask about that, and then ask in the follow-ups probably around, what happens to those skills and capabilities beyond, and I'm interested too in the nature of that support post housing, because I wonder whether it's not ambitious enough. And I understand that I understand the limitations and the funding and all of those things, but I'm just wondering if you'd make some comments about A, the nature of what it is that we collect in the projects, and B, the ambition of the support.
Okay. Maybe I'll take up the last point about how long do you need support for. I think there's actually enormous variation. I think you're right that people who survive on the streets for long periods of time, of course they're resourceful. I remember many, many years ago when I first started in this game, probably around about 1990, working in an agency that dealt with homeless young people in the centre of Melbourne. And I was young, and I wasn't young, but I was naive. And I was amazed at how resourceful the kids were. I mean, they might have been resourceful in illegal ways, but nonetheless, they were resourceful, and they certainly weren't stupid. They were often very smart, but, they ended up on the streets. Sorry, to now go back to the point about how long they're going to need support for. I think there is enormous variation in this, and one of the complex issues is that most of these studies tend to show that large numbers of the people have mental health issues. I think in the Melbourne Street Home it was about 75% I showed you on the thing. Now, having mental health issues is a very variable thing, because what typically happens is you have episodes. So, I mean, some people can go, you know, they get their life together, it moves along fine. But often with a mental health issue, you know, something will happen in your life and you get an episode. And I think one consequence of this, and I know the workers at the Melbourne Street to Home think this, is that you can't just actually cut off support at 12 months or 6 months. People may not need support for the next 12 months, but if they get an episode, if their mental health goes down again, they may actually need support in the future. And one of the good things about Street to Home in Melbourne is actually, or Street to Home itself is, I suppose it's not really a pilot program. One consequence is, although the cut-off is officially 12 months, you know, some people have built relationships with particular workers, and the organisation is still there. So, you know, if something bad happens, they tend to come back because they've worked with Larry or Jane or whoever, and they have a relationship with them. And I think when you're dealing particularly with the mental health issues, I just think that you have to think in terms of that, you know, we may need to provide ongoing support to people, not all the time, but there may be times in the future when they will need it. Cam, do you want to add?
I'll just say, I think picking up on that idea of resourcefulness in street outreach, it is really important, and that's the argument that I'm putting forward in terms of street outreach being a dynamic and interactional process, and it's not something that's merely done to someone who's homeless, but it's something that needs to be not only dynamic, but it needs to be flexible and to take account of their subjectivity and what's happening in their lives and the things that they do, the agency they express, both in terms of resourcefulness and also other types of activities. And I think when the outreach can take account of those things and respond in a way accordingly, that's when it's successful. In terms of support, I think that's really important, because when I was speaking with policy officers recently, they said that there are a number of people who were allocated social housing tenancies through the homelessness programs, and they've been more likely to lose their tenancies when they look back over their documents. And there's no sense whatsoever that and they try to make the argument that these people weren't housing ready, and I'm trying to argue to them that this notion of housing readiness is perhaps redundant. What we need to do is think about ensuring that the housing and the support is appropriate to their needs, and in the absence of support, often the tenancy does fall over. But rather than seeing this in terms of an individual being not housing ready, I think it's more appropriate to see it in terms of our housing models and our supports weren't ready. And I think the idea of support is really, really, really important, because many people have said to me who are homeless, I just want someone in my life who's not paid to be there, either a service provider or a researcher. And I think the idea of support, really trying to broker those more social and friendships and personal dimensions, are really, really important. And I think you picked up on that earlier this morning in terms of clubs. So I think the idea of housing and support's a really, really complicated and interesting, but nevertheless fundamentally important space.
Yes, I think we've got time for maybe one more question.
Residential care, yeah. Now, my major concern is, and from all the data and picking up on your point, Cameron, that our young people have been in supported accommodation for quite some time, quite often, and they're quite institutionalised, unfortunately, in some degree. They lack the ability, some lack the ability to maintain a home, you know. When they're Housing SA work quite closely with our department, but some of our young people just can't cope with that setup and end up, I believe that our statistics would be quite high in the homeless sector moving forward. And I'm wondering where we can bridge that gap in the whole thing, you know. I've got one lad turning 18 next week, and it's a huge fear of mine, along with many others that I've worked with over the past, that are going to end up in this system and, you know, maybe at 45 are sleeping rough still. I just, you know, it's a challenge to all of us, I think, to pick these people up before they get to that stage. I don't know if you have any ideas with that.
I think there are a number of things to say. The first thing is that if you've been, in residential care, the risk levels are much higher in terms of getting into the homeless population. I did a big study with Guy Johnson where we had about a sample of, I think it was about 3,000 homeless people of all ages, and 42% of them had been in, 3,000 adults, they were all 21 or older, and 42% of that sample had been in resi care. Now, the actual proportion of kids who go into resi care in any age group is about 0.5. It's absolutely tiny. And I've seen a number of other studies where a figure around about the 40% mark. So the risk levels for kids who come through resi care are much higher. The second point, I think, is that it's really difficult when you get picked up when you're older, if you haven't had experience, as it were, of running your own home. People who come into the homeless population who, for example, I don't know, say in their 20s they were partnered, or in their 20s they had a house, but in their 30s their relationship failed, or they got mental health issues, whatever. Often because they've had a period of stability where they've lived either on their own or with a partner, or with a partner and kids, and had a house or had a flat, it's easier to help them. When they've got no history of that, and of course some of the kids that you're talking about who come through resi care and then don't establish, if they've had no history, it does actually seem to be just much more difficult to work with them. That isn't really answering your question in terms of what do we do. But I mean, at one level, cutting off support at 18. Well, the first answer is you shouldn't be cutting off support at 18. But preparing people to, as it were, live on their own, is important. And how did most of us learn that? Well, how did I learn to clean the house? Well, I actually learned because my mum taught me. And how did I learn to do the ironing? Well, I actually learned, my mother was fairly formidable. She taught me that too and told me how to do it in a certain way. I mean, I'm being a bit silly, but most of us, how do we learn to do things? We actually learn from mum and dad about how bills have to be paid and how things have to be organised and how you have to keep all the bills in one drawer so you don't lose them and so on. And the kids who come into resi care are typically coming from very, very, what's the right word, disadvantaged, dysfunctional backgrounds. I mean, they're coming from families that don't work. And so they haven't had that learning experience. Cam, do you want to?
We are.
We are, yeah. Sorry, we better stick to the program time.